Hello again, and welcome to Astronomy Toronto. My name is Randy Attwood. This show is produced by the Toronto Centre of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, where we look at the activities of both professional and amateur astronomers here in the Toronto area. Today I'm very pleased to have as my guest Dr. Helen Hogg of the Dunlap Observatory, who has written this book, The Stars Belong to Everyone, which should be required reading for anyone who's interested in astronomy. Hello, Dr. Hogg. How are you?
Greetings, Randy.
A bit about Dr. Hogg. She studied astronomy at the Holyoke College in Massachusetts and just recently attended her 55th reunion. She attained her PhD at Radcliffe College at Harvard, where she worked with Dr. Harlow Shapley on globular clusters, and that's been her interest and her work ever since. Her husband, Dr. Frank Hogg, was the first to receive a PhD from Harvard, and Dr. Hogg moved to Toronto to the David Dunlap Observatory of the University of Toronto, which is situated in Richmond Hill, in 1935. Dr. Hogg is the Professor Emeritus of Astronomy of the U of T, and in both 1968 and 1976, she received the highest rank of Companion of the Order of Canada. So we're very, very happy to have you here today. By the way, she's also the Honorary President of our Royal Astronomical Society of Canada.
Yes.
Well, today we're going to be talking about the early happenings, the beginnings of astronomy in Toronto. And I guess we're going to be starting way back in the early 1800s. Toronto must have been a very, very different place way back then.
I gather so, Randy, from what I read. Today, Toronto is very strong in astronomy, in interest, and in the resources that we have here. But 150 years ago, that was not the case. And Toronto itself was just growing. I'm intrigued with a quote from Mrs. Jameson, who visited Toronto in 1837, and she wrote, "There is a commercial newsroom in Toronto, and this is absolutely the only place of assembly or amusement except the taverns and low drinking houses." And in the 1840s, just after her visit, Toronto began to grow. There were, well, it had been growing, of course, before then, but in the 1840s there were 25,000 people, and gas street lighting came in, and the electric telegraph, about 1847, and there were plans to bring the railroad here, and the water supply came from pipes from the lake, and then the sewers went back into the bay.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the 1840s.
And then just after that, there was the Magnetic Observatory?
In 1839, the Magnetic Observatory was established. Two very famous Europeans, Gauss and Alexander von Humboldt. Gauss, the mathematician, and von Humboldt, who wrote the Cosmos, said that the Earth's magnetism should be studied at various points around the Earth, and Toronto, or at least Eastern Canada, was one that was picked. And so in 1839, the Magnetic Observatory came here.
We have a picture of that we can get in here. And this is actually situated down by Fort York, isn't it?
Yes, and then it was moved up to the U of T campus, and eventually it went into what is the Meteorological Observatory and grew into the Meteorological Service of Canada. So it didn't grow into astronomical things.
Right. We have a slide of the directors of this the Magnetic Observatory.
And the upper right there is Captain Lefroy, who was an outstanding director in the 1840s. Health took him back to England in the 1850s. And he was instrumental in getting the Canadian Institute established, which it was in 1849.
And it's been going strong ever since.
It has just finished its 132nd session, and is Canada's oldest scientific society.
of which you were the first female president in 1965.
That's right.
Quite a precedent-setting
I
appointment.
have a great deal of interest in it, and I spent quite a lot of time reading back in the records to see how it was really the influence of the Institute that got the Astronomical Society going. And the Institute began to publish its accounts of its meetings and so forth in something called the Canadian Journal in 1852. And that is a fascinating thing. That lasted for 20 years. And the things that it published I find lovely reading nowadays.
We have some pictures here of what the early buildings of the Royal Canadian Institute,
Yes.
That's where they were housed, right?
Yes, those were in the 1850s, the upper one, and then into the 60s, the lower one, and they were in the region around King and the St. Lawrence Market, in that general region.
And we also have a slide of the cover of one of the Canadian journals, and maybe we can, there it is there.
That's the first issue of the Canadian Journal in 1852. And I'd like to read you what the purpose of the Institute was by its Royal Charter, 1851, November 4, because I think it's a very beautiful statement. A society where men of all shades of religion or politics may meet on the same friendly grounds, nothing more being required of the members of the Canadian Institute than the means, the opportunity, or the disposition to promote those pursuits which are calculated to refine and exalt a people. Isn't that nice?
Wonderful. And that's the charter that they've been following ever since.
Yes, that's right. So the Canadian Journal held the accounts of the meetings and papers presented at them. It picked up reprints from the European journals and published them. It had a division called Scientific Intelligence. I like that. That was the heading for notes on various aspects of science.
But it would certainly have a different meaning today.
Oh my, does it ever. And in 1854, a Mr. Henning Esquire read a paper on meteors and falling stars, in which he called attention to the lovely conditions for Canadians to observe meteors and indicated that in the catalogs that have been compiled showing the recorded observations, I have not been able to find the name of Canada bearing any very conspicuous position. And it's lovely that now, in this century, Canada is one of the foremost countries of the world in meteor
Sure,
research.
many people out listening today don't realize that, but
No,
Canada certainly
no,
is.
in all phases of meteor research.
That's right. So, well, Dr. Henning, did you just read that on Dr. Henning, the meteor?
Yes, that's what he said.
That's what,
he,
that was from
he
Dr. Henning.
urged Canadians to observe meteors, and whether the people that took up meteor work did it as a result of his urging or not, I don't know. But anyway, it's been done.
Certainly
we can
has.
be proud of it.
So after Dr. Henning, there was a great man, Andrew Elvins, who you are an authority on him. You seem to have spent a lot of your time reading about Mr. Elvins.
Well, I wish I'd met him, but he was long before my time. He was a most remarkable man, Randy. He was born in Cornwall, in England, and his father had worked in the tin mines there. And he came to Canada about 1844 or so, a 6 weeks voyage, and it's recorded that they were very glad to eat something besides salt pork after they got to Quebec City. And he journeyed from there by water to Ottawa, and then down to eventually to Cobourg, where he lived for some years, and he collected fossils. He found he was in the Trenton limestone belt, made a wonderful fossil collection. Then in 1860, he moved to Toronto, and he had a mortgage to pay off, and he had to sell his fossils, which hurt him badly. And he began to work for a tailor establishment, the Mammoth, on the King Street region, as a cutter. And he worked from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And so to occupy his spare moments, he needed something for a hobby between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m., and that was astronomy. And he read, as soon as he got to Toronto, he was reading in those buildings of the Canadian Institute, which you've just shown, and he was reading things like the Canadian Journal, and finding all this of great interest. But by 1868, he thought there should be a similar society founded just for astronomy. And that is what he managed to do. And I think that the Leonid meteor shower, which came again in 1877 and 78, must have had a great impression on the region. In fact, the director of the observatory here reported 2286 meteors in 67 and 2486 in 68 on the nights of November 13 to 14.
That's an incredible amount of meteors just on any given night. You might find one or two in a few minutes, but thousands are
those Leonid showers, I think the one of 1833 was really responsible for the growth of religious sects in some part of this continent, because it was very frightening for people. The sky is like a giant umbrella with flaming spokes.
I think we have a slide of this.
Yes.
And
that's the shower of 1833 over Niagara.
Just the way it's depicted, it's obviously a very scary thing. Especially the one, it looks like there's one just falling right at the base of the falls. I don't think that would really happen because meteors, they burn up.
The meteors come so fast you can hardly count them. And that illustration was used for the cover of the book you're holding, which was the centennial effort of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, Astronomy in Canada.
I have a picture here of Andrew Elvins. Maybe we could take a look at that, because he was, as you say, a most remarkable man.
He had a long life into his 95th year, and the issue of the journal which you're holding there, Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, was largely devoted to him after his death.
This is the one. This is the Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society in March 1919. So it's seen some better days, but it's certainly something I'm sure you must cherish very much.
Oh yes, he spent some time trying to link up the rainfall around Toronto with the sunspot curve. He was really ahead of his time with that. That is a pretty complicated problem. how much weather ties in with sunspots, as you know.
Mm-hmm.
But he spent quite a while on that.
He was also the founder of what we know as today of the Royal Astronomical Society, wasn't
That's
he?
right. In December of 1868, he gathered a few friends to his house, and on January 5th in 1869, they had the initial meeting of the society, and this was the purpose, that a society be formed under the name of the Toronto Astronomical Club, having for its object the aiding of each other in the pursuit of astronomical knowledge.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do today.
Yes, isn't that nice?
So I'm sure he'd be pleased.
I'm sure he would. Mm-hmm.
He, with some other gentlemen, started not the Royal Astronomical Society, had a different name back then.
The Toronto Astronomy Club,
Mm-hmm.
and then in a few months they changed it to Society because they thought that was more dignified.
Mm-hmm. And they would meet at Mr. Elvins' home.
And they kept records for that year. And the man that kept the records was one Daniel K. Winder,
Mm-hmm.
who some years earlier had come to Toronto from Ohio because he was a pacifist and wanted to avoid the Civil War. And he must have been quite an outstanding person. For one thing, he wrote a book on mushrooms. He had many interests. And he seems, while he lasted here, he must have been one of the main ones in the club. And then he returned to the U.S. But in the summer of 69, 1869 that is, he visited the great observatory at Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that visit, plus the knowledge that he would have had from growing up in Ohio, I think that that visit left a real impact on the members of the Astronomical Society here. Their desire for a big telescope, you see, which Cincinnati acquired almost overnight, and really the first big one in the United States.
Mm-hmm. We have a picture, a slide of the founding members of the Toronto Astronomical Club, which just at the turn of the century became the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, and there's Mr. Elvins right in the center.
Yes. His friends seem to have been really devoted to him. The notices in the journal after he died show that he really was a most remarkable person, and although the meetings of the society were not regular at all from 69 to 1890, Elvins sort of kept the flame going.
Mm-hmm. Well, it was very difficult at that time because some of the members weren't too close to his home, and it might take a few months just to get a letter to tell them that there was a meeting and then to get the response
Yes.
back.
Yes, things were different in those days.
Well, when you mention the Cincinnati Observatory, this, of course, had a large effect on it, and I think we have a picture here of what the Cincinnati Observatory looked like back on, when would this be, at the turn of the century?
That was when it started. 1843, the cornerstone was laid, and this was due to the efforts of one man, Ormsby McKnight Mitchell. And he became convinced that Cincinnati should have a large telescope, and he got 300 people to promise $25 each, $7,500, which was a lot of money in those days.
Certainly would have been, yes.
And he went to Europe, and he found that the telescope he could get would cost $10,000 and was an 11.5-inch refractor made by Fraunhofer's firm. And he ordered it and came back to raise the additional money and found there was quite a slump in business, and some of the people that had promised even the 25 weren't very eager to give it up. But he managed to get the money.
We have a picture of him here we can take a look
And
at.
he died in the Civil War after only a year or two in the war of yellow fever.
Well, he was a general, wasn't he?
Yes. And to build the observatory, when he found that lime for cement was expensive, he made a lime kiln himself, and he contracted for horses to pull loads of gravel up. It's just fantastic what that man did, and he was really a legend in that region, and I think that Mr. Winder must have come back with some of the enthusiasm that Mitchell had a couple of decades before.
When you talk, this observatory was on Adams Hill, and you have a saying by John Quincy Adams, I think.
That's right. That was a whole story, really. John Quincy Adams, when he became President of the United States, about 1825, was very eager for the Congress to establish a national observatory, and they wouldn't do it. And he was much disappointed. And then in 1840, along came a fortune from James Smithson. And again, Adams thought perhaps some of that would go for astronomy. But it didn't. It went to the Smithsonian Institution. But now the Smithsonian does have astronomy.
That's right.
But anyway, came 1843, and at long last, Adams could see a big observatory established in the United States, and he gave the address for the laying of the cornerstone, and he made a famous remark, which I've often quoted: "The progress of a people on its career of civilization may be gauged by the number of observatories on its soil." And now, as you said, Randy, we have to expand that a little bit and say observatories within its control a bit, because we have the Canada, France, Hawaii telescope in
That's
the
right.
Warrior that we have a share in. Canada does.
And of course, the University of Toronto has a telescope down in Chile.
24-inch in Chile, yes. So we have to expand John Quincy Adams' remarks, but the idea is right.
So how does Canada rate with other countries in the world with observatories under its domain? Is it?
I think in proportion to the population fairly well, yes. At one time, very briefly, we had the largest telescope in the world.
That's the David Dunlap Observatory
No,
in
that
Richmond
was the DAO then in
Hill?
1918,
In Victoria.
before the 100-inch got going.
Well, maybe we should talk now a bit about Dr. Chant and how he was involved.
Yes, we've been talking about the struggles in the mid-19th century, and it's nice to know that the dreams of the people then eventually came true. It didn't go as swiftly as it did in Cincinnati, but in the 1890s, Dr. Clarence Augustus Chant came on the scene, and he had graduated from the University of Toronto and came back to the physics department, became intensely interested in the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. That wasn't what it was called until 1903. And he was a tie-in between the University of Toronto and the society. And astronomy developed very rapidly after that. It was wonderful. But it wasn't until in the 1920s that Chant saw his dream of a big telescope come true. And that was 1921. He held a conversation with David Dunlap, who expressed interest in doing the instrument.
Who was David Dunlap?
Well, he was a lawyer who had been in the staking and whatnot of the big Ontario mines, I think Hollinger.
So he had enough money to
And
build a telescope if need
yes,
be.
and very philanthropic-minded, too. And he died before anything was done about the telescope. But his widow, a beautiful lady, Mrs. Jessie Dunlap,
Mm-hmm.
in 1926 was in touch with Dr. Chant, and the David Dunlap Observatory resulted. 1935 it was opened as a gift of Mrs. Dunlap to the University of Toronto.
I think we take a quick look at a slide of Mr. Dunlap.
Yes, that's the portrait. I think that's the one that hangs in the Observatory Library.
Right. And the next slide is of Dr. Chant and Mrs. Dunlap. Maybe we just move on to that one in a minute. And of course, Dr. Chant is remembered in the Royal Astronomical Society, and there's a Chant medal that's given out.
And he had a remarkable record. That is Moffat Dunlap laying the cornerstone of the observatory, and President Cody there. Moffat Dunlap was the only son of the Dunlaps.
Right. And I think we have another slide there which does show Dr. Chant and Mrs. Dunlap at the observatory itself. Maybe that'll come up in a minute or two. But this medal is oh, there we go.
Yes,
We'll see
there's
that.
Mrs. Dunlap, a most gracious and wonderful lady, very philanthropic-minded.
Right.
And Dr. Chant has a remarkable record of 50 years as editor of the Journal of the Society and of the Handbook.
Right. And the handbook, of course, is recognized as something that every amateur or professional astronomer can use as a tool to observe with.
Yes.
It's actually world-renowned.
He was the one that built both of them up, both the Journal and the Handbook. And you'll be having another program later on, I think, on the work of the observatory and so forth, I hope.
Well, that's right. We hope to go up there sometime this summer with Doug Guys, who is a graduate student in astronomy at the University of Toronto, and we'll take a look at what's going on up there. Of course, the main problem is, as you've been able to see in the years you've worked there, as Toronto has grown, the light has also grown, and Richmond Hill isn't a little country town anymore. It's nearly part of Toronto, and the light being so bright, you really can't do that much work anymore.
Well, there are some things we can do, and that the lights don't interfere too much, but certain other programs are difficult.
Well, I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed having you here today. I've been looking forward to having you on Astronomy Toronto, and I hope that maybe sometime in the future we'll be able to have you on to talk about your love and your work in globular clusters.
Well, thank you, Randy. I enjoy very much talking about these past things because there's so much going on nowadays that oftentimes people don't have time to look back and give credit to the people who started things, which they deserve to have.
It's good to look back, and it helps you looking forward. Thanks again. Well, Astronomy Toronto is seen now on the last Thursday of every month at 8 o'clock on the Rogers Network. And so until next time, I'd like to thank you for watching Astronomy Toronto. My name is Randy Attwood. Bye for now.